okay? This isn't for visitors. Laundry's for residents only. There's a sign right there.
I'm not a visitor. I live on the third floor, apartment 3B. My code opens the door, same as yours.
Sure you do.
Been here 2 years. I pay rent. I get the emails. I'm just trying to wash my clothes.
Julia Vance had only been living in the building for 6 months, yet she already acted as if it belonged to her. When she spotted Nia Baxter, a black woman she didn't recognize, trying to get into the laundry room, Julia didn't see a fellow tenant. She saw an intruder. She stood in the doorway, ignored the key code, and started grilling her. She had no clue that the woman she was confronting had been living there for years, or that the building's superintendent was about to appear and completely shatter her sense of control. What you just witnessed was a textbook case of gatekeeping, a new resident trying to control someone who had been around longer. You saw the clash. Now we're going to give you the full picture and show the moment authorities stepped in to set things straight. If you think neighbors should mind their own business, hit subscribe. To understand why this encounter got so out of hand, you need to know who Nia Baxter really was and why someone like Julia Vance had never met her before that sticky Tuesday evening in the basement laundry room of their Chicago apartment building. Nia Baxter was 35, a surgical resident at one of the city's busiest hospitals, and had lived in apartment 3B for 2 full years. Her days were a non-stop loop of surgeries, patient rounds, paperwork, and maybe 4 hours of sleep if she was lucky. She worked 80-hour weeks, sometimes more. When she finally got home, it was often well past midnight, and she would crash into bed still in her scrubs, too drained even to think about the laundry piling up in the corner of her room. The building itself was a mid-rise apartment complex on Chicago's northwest side, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves and could live there for years without knowing a neighbor's name. It wasn't unfriendly exactly, just the kind of anonymous city living Nia actually preferred. She didn't have the energy for idle chatter in the elevator or at neighborhood barbecues. She paid her rent on time, followed all the rules, and expected to be left alone, and for 2 years that's exactly what happened. She was practically invisible in the building, a ghost who came and went at strange hours, which suited her perfectly. But that Tuesday was different. Nia had a rare day off, not a full day, just a half day, and she decided to tackle all the little chores that had piled up during her exhausting schedule. Laundry topped the list. She had been rotating the same scrubs for weeks, washing them in her bathroom sink only when absolutely necessary. Now her hamper was bursting. She collected everything into a large canvas laundry basket, grabbed her detergent bottle, and made her way down to the basement laundry room. Her phone was in her back pocket, keys in hand, and she was already planning which loads to tackle first. The laundry room was behind a heavy metal door at the end of the basement hallway, locked with a 4-digit code. Every resident got the code when they moved in, and it changed every 6 months for security. Nia had received the new code in an email from management just a few weeks earlier. She entered the numbers without a second thought, heard the lock click open, and pushed the door with her shoulder while balancing the full basket on her hip. That's when she ran into Julia Vance. Julia was standing just inside, folding a pile of towels on the long counter that stretched along one wall. She was in her mid-40s, wearing pricey athleisure that suggested she had either just left or was about to head to a yoga class, though the spotless condition of her clothes hinted it was more about style than exercise. Her hair was tied back neatly in a ponytail, and her expression was one Nia had seen before, the kind of look belonging to someone always scanning for problems that weren't really there. When the door swung open and Nia stepped in, Julia's head snapped up and her eyes widened with something resembling alarm. Julia moved fast, leaving her towels on the counter, and planted herself directly in front of Nia, blocking the entrance to the laundry room. Her arms crossed over her chest, legs spread like a security guard confronting an intruder. Nia froze, confused, the heavy laundry basket still balanced on her hip. She looked at Julia, then at the door behind her, then back at Julia, trying to make sense of the situation. Julia spoke first, her voice sharp and commanding. She told Nia she couldn't just walk in there, that the room wasn't for visitors and that laundry was only for residents. She pointed vaguely to a laminated sign on the wall with the rules, jabbing at it as if it were a piece of evidence in a trial. Nia felt a familiar, draining wave of exhaustion, not the tiredness from long shifts but the deeper fatigue of having to prove she belonged somewhere she had every right to be. She took a slow breath, kept her voice even, and explained that she wasn't a visitor. She lived on the 3rd floor, apartment 3B, and her code had opened the door just like Julia's. Julia scoffed, the sound sharp and cutting. She echoed Nia's words back with exaggerated disbelief, saying sure she did, as if the very thought of Nia living there was ridiculous. Her tone made it clear she didn't believe a single word, that she had already decided who Nia was and why she was there, and no explanation would change her mind. Nia shifted the laundry basket to her other hip, feeling it start to pull on her arm. She tried again, keeping her voice calm but letting a hint of frustration creep in. She told Julia she had been living there for 2 years, paid her rent, received emails from management, and was just trying to do her laundry. The absurdity of defending herself to a stranger in her own building was sinking in, and her patience was wearing thin. But Julia didn't back down. If anything, she seemed encouraged by Nia's explanations, as if speaking up proved her guilt. She stepped closer, her voice rising slightly, and demanded to know how Nia had gotten the code. She warned that codes could be shared, that visitors sometimes obtained them from residents, and that knowing the code didn't prove someone actually lived there. She implied with barely hidden suspicion that Nia could have gotten it from anyone, even stolen it, that there were countless ways people could gain access to buildings they didn't belong in. The accusation hung between them, and Nia felt a tightness in her chest. This wasn't about laundry or rules or codes. This was about Julia looking at her, a black woman carrying a laundry basket, and deciding she was a threat. She had seen someone who didn't match her narrow idea of who belonged and had appointed herself judge, jury, and gatekeeper. Nia had faced this kind of treatment before in different situations and different places, but it never stopped hitting like a punch to the stomach. The assumption that she was doing something wrong, the burden of proof forced onto her, the exhausting effort of showing she hadn't done anything but exist. She set the laundry basket down on the floor and straightened her back, standing tall. She looked Julia squarely in the eyes and asked if she was seriously not going to let her do her laundry. She reminded her that she had used the code, that she lived there, and that she didn't need approval from someone she'd never seen before. Her voice was steady, but carried the edge of someone who had spent years in high-pressure environments and wasn't about to be intimidated by a nosy neighbor with too much free time. Julia's face flushed red, and she dug in even harder. She insisted she was just following the rules, looking out for the building's safety, and that residents had a duty to report suspicious activity. She claimed she had every right to question someone she didn't know, that it was her responsibility as a concerned neighbor. She pulled out her phone, holding it up like a weapon, threatening to call the building manager, the police, or whoever was necessary to handle the situation. She practically radiated self-righteousness, convinced she was the hero in this story. The standoff might have gone on forever if not for the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Both women turned as the door opened again and the building's superintendent stepped in. A man in his late 50s, wearing a maintenance uniform with his name stitched on the chest pocket, carrying a toolbox in one hand. He had worked in the building for over a decade and recognized every tenant, if not always by name. He took in the scene immediately, his gaze moving from Julia's defensive stance to Nia's laundry basket on the floor, and his expression shifted to one of weary recognition, as if he'd witnessed this exact drama before. Julia seized the moment, turning to him with a look of self-satisfaction. She pointed toward Nia and launched into her explanation, telling him that this woman had entered the laundry room, claimed she lived there, but Julia had never seen her before. She said she was concerned about the building's security and felt he should know about potential trespassers. Her words spilled out quickly, tumbling over each other, as if speed would make her story more convincing. The superintendent held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He glanced past Julia at Nia and his face softened into a small, genuine smile. He greeted her warmly, asking how the hospital was treating her, calling her Dr. Baxter, the title falling naturally from his lips. Relief washed over Nia and she returned his greeting with a tired but grateful smile. Turning back to Julia, his expression hardened. In a calm, no-nonsense tone, he confirmed that Dr. Baxter had lived in the building since 2021, that she was a surgical resident who worked long hours and was rarely home, and that she had every right to use the laundry facilities. Then he looked at Julia with a hint of disappointment and reminded her that Mrs. Vance had only moved in last October, just 6 months ago, suggesting she step aside so Dr. Baxter could get her laundry done. The change in Julia was immediate and striking. Her face drained of color, leaving blotchy red patches across her cheeks and neck. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She glanced from the superintendent to Nia and back again, as if hoping someone would declare this all a misunderstanding, that she had been right, but no one spoke. The silence was heavy, damning, and Julia seemed to shrink under its weight. She stammered something about keeping the building safe, about not having seen Nia before, about how anyone would have acted the same way. But even to her own ears the words sounded empty, and she trailed off, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The superintendent simply stepped aside, gesturing for Nia to enter the laundry room. Julia had no choice but to move against the wall, pressing herself into it as if she could disappear. Nia lifted her laundry basket and walked past her without a word. She didn't glare, didn't mutter a snide remark, didn't react at all. She simply moved to one of the empty washing machines and began loading her clothes. Her hands trembled slightly, adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins, but she forced herself to concentrate on the simple task at hand. Measuring detergent, setting the water temperature, feeding quarters into the machine. Normal things she should have been able to do without having to justify her right to exist. Julia grabbed her folded towels and bolted from the laundry room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The superintendent lingered for a moment, toolbox in hand, and quietly apologized to Nia. He said he would be speaking with the management company about what had happened, that this behavior was unacceptable, and that she should never have to endure this kind of harassment in her own home. Nia thanked him, her voice thick with emotion she was barely holding back, and he left her alone with the rhythmic hum of the washing machine starting its cycle. For several minutes Nia just stood there, hands gripping the edge of the washer, head bowed. She felt the exhaustion she'd carried for weeks, months, years settle over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of all the times she'd been questioned in places where she belonged. Times she'd had to prove she wasn't stealing while shopping. Times she'd been followed by security. Times someone had clutched their purse a little tighter as she passed. She thought about being a doctor, about spending her days saving lives. And yet a stranger in her own building had looked at her and assumed she was a criminal. When she finally left the laundry room an hour later, her clothes tumbling dry in the machines, she didn't go back to her apartment. She went to the building's management office on the first floor and filed a formal harassment complaint against Julia Vance. She explained the incident in detail, how she'd been blocked from the laundry room, accused of trespassing, and subjected to racial profiling in her own home. The property manager listened with growing concern, took careful notes, and assured Nia that the matter would be addressed seriously. The consequences for Julia Vance came quickly. Within 48 hours, a lease violation notice appeared on her door. The letter cited the harassment complaint and outlined the building's policies against discriminatory behavior and tenant harassment. It warned that any future incidents would lead to immediate lease termination. The notice was formal and legal, making it clear that management would not tolerate residents taking it upon themselves to police their neighbors based on racial bias. Julia tried to defend herself, sending multiple emails to the management office, insisting she had been misunderstood, that she was only concerned about security, that she hadn't meant any harm. But her excuses fell flat. Security camera footage from the hallway outside the laundry room showed her blocking Nia's entrance, her aggressive stance, the pointed finger, the superintendent stepping in, and Julia's hasty retreat. There was no room for doubt about what had happened. Word spread through the building as fast as gossip always does in close quarters. Other residents who had experienced Julia's self-appointed security patrols, her demands to see keys and IDs, her pointed questions about where people were going and why, began sharing their own stories. It quickly became clear that Nia wasn't the first person Julia had harassed, just the first one bold enough to file a formal complaint. Several other residents of color came forward with similar stories, describing how Julia had questioned their right to be in the building, followed them to their doors, and made them feel unwelcome in their own homes. The property management company held a meeting with Julia, and while the details were kept private, the change in her behavior was obvious. She stopped roaming the hallways. She stopped questioning unfamiliar residents. She kept her head down and her door closed. And when she did encounter neighbors, she avoided eye contact. The woman who had been so confident in asserting her authority just 6 months into her lease had become a pariah in her own building. For Nia, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had stood up for herself, refused to be intimidated, and held Julia accountable. The management company had supported her. The superintendent had validated her. Justice, in its bureaucratic way, had been served. But none of that erased the deep violation of the experience. None of it restored the peace of mind she had once taken for granted, the ability to move through her own building without wondering if someone was watching, judging, or questioning whether she belonged. She continued her work at the hospital, maintaining her grueling schedule of surgeries, rounds, and sleepless nights. She kept coming home to apartment 3B in the early hours, kept using that basement laundry room, but something had changed. She was more aware of the other residents, more cautious about who was in the hall when she left her apartment, more attuned to the subtle ways people looked at her or didn't. The invisibility that had once been comforting now felt like a vulnerability. Julia Vance eventually moved out. Her lease ended without renewal several months later. Whether she left on her own or was encouraged to go was never clear, but her departure was met with quiet relief by many of the residents. The building returned to its usual rhythm, people coming and going without drama, neighbors coexisting in their separate spheres. Yet the incident left its mark. It became a story that circulated, a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and prejudice, about the harm that comes from appointing yourself the guardian of spaces you barely know. It was a reminder that racism doesn't always appear as overt violence or explicit slurs, but in the everyday decisions to question, to block, to demand proof from people who owe you nothing. Nia Baxter never forgot that Tuesday in the laundry room. Years later, when telling the story to friends or colleagues, she would still feel the anger rise, still remember the weight of having to justify her existence to a stranger. But she would also recall the moment the superintendent walked in and addressed her as Dr. Baxter, the moment her identity was acknowledged and Julia's assumptions were shattered. It was a small victory in the face of a much larger problem, but a victory nonetheless. The story of what happened in that Chicago apartment building laundry room is far from unique. Across the country, in buildings, neighborhoods, and public spaces, Black people and other people of color face these microaggressions and acts of racial profiling every single day. They are questioned in their own apartment buildings, followed in stores, stopped by police simply for existing in spaces where others have decided they don't belong. They are forced to prove their legitimacy over and over, carrying the weight of other people's prejudices and fears. Julia Vance was not an anomaly. She was a product of a society that teaches people to be suspicious of difference, to see threat in unfamiliar faces, to assume authority over spaces and people they have no right to control. Her 6 months in the building somehow convinced her she knew better than everyone else who belonged there, that her limited experience outweighed Nia's 2 years of actual residency. Her racism, whether conscious or unconscious, led her to see a black woman with a laundry basket as someone who needed to be stopped, questioned, and controlled. The resolution of this story, with the superintendent confirming Nia's residency and Julia facing consequences, offers a rare form of justice. More often, incidents like this end without accountability, without anyone in authority stepping in to set the record straight. More often, the person being harassed is left to navigate the situation alone, while the harasser faces no repercussions. What makes this story resonate is not just the confrontation itself, but the larger questions it raises. Who gets to feel safe in their own home, who gets to move through the world without scrutiny, and who bears the burden of other people's biases? Nia Baxter had every right to be in that laundry room. She had paid for that right for 2 years through her rent and her adherence to building policies. Yet Julia Vance's assumptions, rooted in racial prejudice, tried to override all of that. In Julia's mind, her 6 months in the building gave her more authority than Nia's 2 years, simply because she couldn't imagine that a black woman belonged in the same place she did. The security camera that recorded the incident serves as a stark reminder that these confrontations happen all around us, often without witnesses, often without documentation. How many people have been blocked from spaces they have every right to enter? How many have been questioned, harassed, and made to feel like intruders in their own homes? And how many Julias have walked away from these encounters without ever facing consequences, convinced they were just doing their civic duty? This story is a call to examine our own assumptions and biases. It's a reminder to pause before questioning someone's right to be somewhere, to ask whether our suspicions are based on real evidence or on prejudices we've absorbed. It's a reminder that being a good neighbor means minding your own business, respecting others' space, and understanding that you don't have the right to police everyone around you. For Julia Vance, that Tuesday in the laundry room became a moment of public humiliation she could never undo. For Nia Baxter, it was another chapter in a lifetime of proving her humanity and her right to exist in places where she should never have been questioned. And for everyone who hears this story, it becomes a choice about what kind of society we want to live in, and what we're willing to do to ensure that everyone, no matter their race, can simply do their laundry in peace.